At my cousin's promotion party, my mom smirked loud enough for everyone to hear. "Careful, everyone. He's still the family failure who can't hold a job." My sister snorted. "Don't worry, he'll ask for money before dessert." I raised my glass and said, "Funny, since I bought this venue in cash last week." I, 32M, stood in the corner of the banquet hall, watching my cousin bask in congratulations from our extended family. The champagne in my hand had gone warm, but I kept holding it anyway, a prop to blend into the background where I'd spent the last decade of family gatherings. The venue was nice, I had to admit. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, crystal chandeliers, white marble floors that probably cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. My cousin had gotten promoted to regional director at his firm. Good for him. I genuinely meant that. He'd worked hard, played the corporate game well, and now he was reaping the rewards. Our family treated it like he'd won a Nobel Prize. Aunts and uncles circled him like he was holding court, each trying to get a moment of his attention to associate themselves with his success. I took another sip of warm champagne and checked my phone. My business partner had texted asking about the building inspection scheduled for Monday. I replied quickly, confirming the time, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. Mom saw me standing alone and made her way over. I could see it in her eyes before she even opened her mouth. That look, the one that said she'd found her target for the evening. My sister trailed behind her, smirking in that way she'd perfected since high school. Mom didn't bother lowering her voice. She never did. She announced to everyone within earshot that they should be careful around me because I was still the family failure who couldn't hold a job. The conversations around us stuttered to a halt. Heads turned. My sister added her contribution, snorting that I'd probably ask someone for money before dessert was served. The silence spread through the room like spilled wine. My cousin stopped mid-sentence. My uncle's fork clinked against his plate. Even the servers seemed to pause in their routes through the tables. I'd heard variations of this for years. Every family gathering, every holiday, every chance encounter at the grocery store. I'd lost count of how many times Mom had introduced me to her friends as her disappointing son, or how many times my sister had made jokes about my lifestyle to anyone who would listen. What they didn't know was that 6 years ago, I'd stopped trying to prove myself to them. I'd stopped showing up to family dinners with explanations about my business ventures or investment strategies. I'd learned that nothing I said would change their minds. They decided who I was when I dropped out of the corporate track at 26, and no amount of evidence would convince them otherwise. So I'd gone quiet. I'd built my life away from their scrutiny, away from their judgment. I'd made my money, made my moves, and kept my mouth shut. But standing there, watching my mother's satisfied smirk and my sister's gleeful expression, something shifted. Maybe it was the warm champagne. Maybe it was the fact that I'd spent 3 hours driving to attend this party out of some misguided sense of family obligation. Maybe I was just tired. I raised my glass and told them it was funny they mentioned money, since I'd bought this venue in cash the previous week. The silence that followed was different from the first one. This wasn't the awkward pause after a social humiliation. This was the sound of a record scratch, of brains struggling to process information that didn't fit their established narratives. My mother's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, anger, then back to disbelief. My sister's smirk froze, then melted into something harder to read. My cousin recovered first. He asked if I was joking. His voice was careful, like he was talking to someone who might be having a breakdown. I told him I wasn't joking. I pulled out my phone and showed him the LLC documents, the deed transfer, the wire confirmation from my bank. The venue manager, who'd been standing near the bar, caught my eye and gave a small nod of recognition. We'd spoken twice on the phone and met once in person to finalize the purchase. My cousin stared at the documents on my phone screen. Then he looked at me like he'd never seen me before. He asked why I'd never mentioned it. I shrugged and said he'd never asked. None of them had ever asked what I actually did for work. They'd just assumed, filled in the blanks with their own stories, and I'd let them. The truth was messy and complicated. After I'd left my corporate job at 26, I'd bounced around for a while. I tried freelancing, tried consulting, tried a dozen different things that didn't quite stick. My family had watched this period with smug satisfaction, convinced they'd been right about me all along. What they hadn't seen was that I was learning. Every failed venture taught me something. Every mistake showed me what not to do next. At 28, I'd partnered with a friend from college on a real estate investment. Small multifamily properties in neighborhoods that were just starting to turn around. We bought low, renovated smart, and either flipped or held depending on the market. The first property barely broke even. The second made a decent profit. By the third, we'd figured out our system. For years later, I owned or had stakes in 17 properties across 3 cities. The portfolio was worth just over $8 million. After leverage and business expenses, my personal net worth sat somewhere around $3 million. Not Bezos money, but comfortable. Very comfortable. I kept it quiet because I didn't need the attention. I didn't need my family suddenly treating me differently or showing up with their hands out. I'd watch what happened to my uncle when he sold his business. Suddenly, everyone was his best friend. Everyone had a great investment opportunity. Everyone needed just a small loan to get back on their feet. But now the cat was out of the bag, at least partially. My mother found her voice. She demanded to know why I'd been letting them think I was struggling if I'd been sitting on money this whole time. Her face was red, her hands shaking slightly. I reminded her that she'd never asked. She'd never shown the slightest curiosity about my actual life. She'd been too busy telling everyone who would listen about her disappointment in me. My sister jumped in, her voice sharp. She said I'd deliberately deceived them, let them worry about me, made them look like fools. I asked her when exactly she'd worried about me. When had any of them checked in, offered support, or expressed anything other than contempt? I'd been to dozens of family events over the past 6 years. Not once had anyone asked about my life with genuine interest. They'd made their jokes, delivered their cutting remarks, and moved on. The venue manager approached and asked if everything was all right. She'd seen the commotion and wanted to make sure there wasn't a problem. I told her everything was fine, apologized for the disturbance, and thanked her for hosting such a lovely event. She smiled and mentioned that the building's previous owners had let it fall into disrepair, but she could see I had good plans for the renovation. She was excited to see what I'd do with the space. After she walked away, my aunt asked what renovation she was talking about. I explained that the venue needed significant work. The HVAC system was 20 years old, the kitchen equipment was outdated, and the ballroom needed new flooring. I'd budgeted $400,000 for renovations over the next 6 months. Once complete, the venue would be one of the premier event spaces in the city. My cousin asked why I'd bought a venue at all. He seemed genuinely curious now, the earlier tension shifting into something else. I told him it was a good investment. The location was prime, the building had good bones, and the previous owners were motivated sellers. I'd gotten it for 20% below market value because they needed to close quickly. After renovations, the property value would increase by at least 30%, and the rental income would cover the operating costs plus generate profit. One of my uncles, who'd always been quieter than the rest of the family, asked what else I did. He had that look people get when they're recalculating everything they thought they knew about someone. I gave him the basics. Real estate investment, primarily multifamily residential and commercial properties. Some flipping, mostly holding for rental income and long-term appreciation. I had a small team now, 5 people including my original partner. We were looking at expanding into a 4th city later this year. The party had effectively split into 2 groups. Half the family was still clustered around my cousin, pretending to maintain the original celebration. The other half had gravitated toward me, drawn by curiosity or possibly the scent of money. My mother hadn't moved. She stood frozen, her expression cycling through emotions I couldn't quite name. Finally, she asked why I hadn't told her. Her voice was smaller now, less certain. I met her eyes and said I'd tried, years ago. When I first started seeing success, I'd mentioned it at a Christmas dinner. She'd laughed and told everyone I was probably running some kind of scam. When I'd shown up to her birthday party in a new car, she'd asked loudly who I'd borrowed it from. Every time I'd attempted to share my life with her, she'd shut me down or turned it into a joke. Eventually, I'd stopped trying. It was easier to let her believe what she wanted to believe than to constantly defend myself. My sister's expression had shifted from shock to something calculating. She mentioned that she'd been looking at investment properties herself recently, struggling to find good deals. Maybe I could give her some advice. The audacity was almost impressive. 5 minutes ago, she'd been mocking me in front of the entire family. Now she wanted advice. I told her I'd think about it, keeping my voice neutral. I wasn't interested in burning bridges, but I also wasn't going to pretend the previous years of contempt hadn't happened. The party continued, but the energy had changed. People kept glancing at me, whispering to each other. My cousin eventually made his way over and apologized for not being more supportive over the years. He admitted he'd just followed the family's lead, assumed they knew what they were talking about. I told him I understood. Family dynamics were complicated. I didn't hold it against him personally. He'd been focused on his own career, his own life. I couldn't blame him for that. He asked if I'd be interested in getting coffee sometime, actually catching up. He seemed genuine, almost relieved to be having a real conversation. I said I'd like that and meant it. My anger wasn't really directed at him. He'd been neutral more than actively hostile. As the evening wound down, my mother approached me one more time. She asked if we could talk privately. We stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the city lights. She started to say something, then stopped. Started again. She told me she didn't know what to say. She'd been so sure about who I was, what I was doing with my life. She'd been worried, she claimed. Worried that I was failing, that I'd end up struggling. I asked her if worry usually manifested as public humiliation and constant criticism. Because from where I stood, it hadn't felt like concern. It had felt like contempt. She flinched, but didn't argue. She asked if I hated her. I told her I didn't hate her. I was disappointed, hurt, frustrated. But hate required more energy than I was willing to spend. Mostly, I just felt sad that we'd lost years we could have spent actually knowing each other. She asked if we could start over. If I could forgive her. I said I didn't know yet. Forgiveness wasn't a light switch. She'd spent 6 years constructing a narrative about who I was, tearing me down at every opportunity. That damage didn't disappear because of one revelation. But I was willing to try if she was actually serious about change. She nodded, tears in her eyes. She said she'd try. We went back inside. The party was breaking up. My cousin thanked everyone for coming, made a small speech about family and support. The irony wasn't lost on me. My sister caught me at the coat check. She apologized, quickly and quietly. She said she'd been jealous, though of what she couldn't quite articulate. She'd followed the family script without questioning it, and now she felt like an idiot. I told her we all made mistakes. What mattered was what came next. Update 1. A week passed before I heard from my mother again. She called and asked if I'd have dinner with her, just the two of us. I agreed, curious to see if her contrition would last beyond the initial shock. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown. She was already seated when I arrived, nervous energy radiating from her. We ordered, made small talk about the weather and traffic, dancing around the real conversation. Finally, she asked me to tell her about my business. Not in a challenging way, but with what seemed like genuine interest. I walked her through it. How I'd started, the early failures, the learning curve. How I'd identified undervalued properties, built relationships with contractors, learned to read markets. She listened, asking occasional questions that suggested she was actually paying attention. She told me she'd spent the past week thinking about the way she'd treated me. She'd talked to her therapist about it, which surprised me. I hadn't known she was seeing a therapist. She said she'd been going for about a year, working through some issues related to control and expectations. She admitted that my success threatened her narrative about herself as much as about me. She'd built her identity partly around being the long-suffering mother of a disappointing son. It gave her sympathy, attention, a role to play in the family drama. Letting go of that meant confronting some uncomfortable truths about herself. I appreciated the honesty, even if it was hard to hear. At least she was being real with me. She asked what she could do to make things right. I told her there wasn't a simple answer. She could start by not talking about me behind my back, not using me as a punchline, treating me like an adult with my own life. Beyond that, we'd have to figure it out as we went. She agreed. We finished dinner on better terms than we'd started. Update 2. 3 months later, things had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. My mother had actually followed through on her commitment to change. She'd stopped making comments about my career, stopped treating me like a perpetual disappointment. It was strange, almost uncomfortable at first. We had to learn how to interact without the familiar patterns of conflict. My sister was a different story. She'd started calling regularly, always with questions about real estate or investment strategies. I helped when I could, but I noticed she was more interested in shortcuts than in understanding the actual work involved. She wanted the results without the process. When I gently pointed this out during one call, she got defensive. She accused me of gatekeeping, of not wanting her to succeed. I told her that wasn't it at all, but real estate investment wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme. It required research, risk tolerance, and patience. She'd hung up on me. The extended family had also recalibrated their treatment of me. Suddenly, I was getting invited to things I'd been excluded from before. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years were reaching out, asking to connect, to catch up. Some seemed genuine. Others had that gleam in their eye that said they saw me as a resource to be tapped. I learned to tell the difference quickly. My cousin and I did get coffee, several times actually. He'd become something like a real friend, which was unexpected. We talked about our careers, our lives, the weird dynamics of our family. He admitted he'd always felt pressure to be the golden child, to live up to the expectations. It was exhausting in its own way. The venue renovation was going well. We were slightly over budget, but on schedule. I'd already booked 3 events for the month after completion. The venue manager was excellent, and I was considering offering her a partnership stake if the first year went as planned. One evening, my mother called with an unusual request. My grandmother, her mother, wanted to see me. Apparently, she'd heard about what happened at the promotion party and had some things she wanted to say. I drove to my grandmother's house the following Sunday. She was in her 80s now, sharp as ever but slowed by arthritis. She made tea and we sat in her living room surrounded by decades of family photos. She told me she'd always known I'd figure things out. She'd watched me as a kid, seen how I approached problems differently than others. When I'd left my corporate job, she'd been worried but not surprised. She'd also been disappointed in how the family had treated me, but she'd stayed quiet, not wanting to cause division. Now she felt she'd been wrong to stay silent. She told me she was proud of me, not just for the financial success, but for how I'd handled the years of criticism. She said it took strength to build something while everyone around you predicted failure. I asked her why she hadn't said something sooner. She admitted she'd been conflict avoidant, a trait she'd passed down through the family. But after hearing about the confrontation at the party, she'd realized that silence could be its own form of harm. We talked for hours. She asked about my properties, my plans, my life outside of work. She told me stories about my grandfather, who'd been an entrepreneur himself, struggled, and succeeded in cycles. She said I reminded her of him. As I was leaving, she pressed an envelope into my hands. Inside was a check for $50,000. She said it was part of my inheritance, but she wanted me to have it now, to use for the business or whatever I needed. She'd rather see me enjoy it than save it for after she was gone. I tried to refuse, but she insisted. She said money should work for the living, not sit waiting for death. Update 3. The venue's grand reopening was scheduled for 6 months after I'd purchased it. We'd completed the renovations under budget thanks to my contractor's efficiency. The space looked incredible, transformed from tired and dated to elegant and modern while maintaining its architectural character. I invited my family to the opening event, not because I needed their validation, but because I wanted them to see what I'd built. And maybe, on some level, I wanted them to understand what they'd missed while they were busy judging me. Most of them came. My mother arrived early and helped with last-minute preparations without being asked. My sister came late, stayed briefly, and left without saying much. My cousin brought his wife and spent the evening networking with other guests, which I actually appreciated. He'd become a good referral source for corporate events. My grandmother sat in a place of honor, holding court with other family members, beaming with obvious pride. At one point, she caught my eye across the room and raised her glass to me. I raised mine back. The evening was a success by any measure. We booked 4 new events that night alone. The catering was excellent, the acoustics perfect, the lighting dramatic in all the right ways. As people filtered out, my mother lingered. She walked through the empty ballroom, her footsteps echoing on the new marble floors. She told me it was beautiful, that I should be proud. I told her I was. She asked if I was happy, not with the business, but with life in general. It was a more thoughtful question than I'd expected from her. I considered it honestly. I told her I was content. I'd built something meaningful, surrounded myself with good people, learned to stop seeking approval from those who wouldn't give it. Was I happy? Most days, yes. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. She nodded like she understood. Then she asked if there was room in my life for her, for a real relationship rather than the fractured thing we'd had before. I told her there was, if she was willing to do the work. Relationships required effort from both sides. I was willing to meet her halfway, but I wouldn't chase her approval anymore. She said that was fair. Looking back on everything, the years of criticism, the deliberate silence about my success, the confrontation at the party, the slow rebuilding afterward, I couldn't say I was glad it happened the way it did. The pain had been real, the damage genuine. But it had also forced necessary conversations, cleared away years of assumptions and miscommunication. I'd learned that you can't control how people see you. You can only control how you respond to their perceptions. For years, I'd let my family's view of me dictate how I saw myself. Breaking free from that had been harder than building a successful business. The venue became my most profitable property within 8 months. The business continued to grow. I hired 3 more people, expanded into 2 additional cities. My partner and I discussed taking the company public eventually, though that was years away. My relationship with my mother improved gradually. We had dinner monthly, sometimes more. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were real. My sister and I remained distant, cordial, but not close. Some relationships couldn't be repaired, and I'd made peace with that. My cousin became one of my closest friends. We played golf badly every other weekend and complained about family drama over beer afterward. Life moved forward as it does. I still think about that moment at the promotion party sometimes. The shock on their faces when I'd revealed the truth. The satisfaction I'd felt, which I'm not entirely proud of but won't deny. It hadn't been about revenge, not really. It had been about finally, after years of silence, saying, "You were wrong about me." And they had been. They'd been wrong about who I was, what I was capable of, where I was headed. They'd written their story about me and refused to update it when the facts changed. But I'd been wrong too. I'd assumed they'd never change, never see me differently. Some of them hadn't, but some had. People were more complicated than the roles we assigned them. The venue is still my favorite property. Not because it's the most profitable, though it is. Not because it's the most prestigious, though it might be. I love it because every time I walk through those doors, I remember the look on my mother's face when I told her I'd bought it. The moment, everything changed. I bought it because it was a good investment. I revealed it because I was tired of being small in their eyes. The revenge, if that's what it was, wasn't in the reveal itself. It was in living well, building something meaningful, and refusing to let their limitations define my possibilities. That was enough.